Okay, welcome back to our podcast. We're still talking to Douglas Wilson, who was here for our pastors' conference this year, and I wanted to continue, Doug, about one of the things. One of the things that came up a couple of times during our conference was the confessions, how the role of confessions, how they should be used, and the Westminster Confession in particular, and how it's being used today. And what have you what are some of your thoughts on this whole thing about what's going on now and the mentality that you see?
Well, let me answer the question by telling first or stating first where I am in regard to this. I'm as a minister of Christ Church in the CREC. I have subscribed to the Westminster Confession, the original English Westminster Confession. In our in the setup in the CREC, each church has to adopt the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, and the definition of Chalcedon, and then they have a choice of one of six reformational confessions of faith, the American Westminster and the English Westminster being the two of the options. So we used to subscribe to one of the other options, and it wasn't until the eruption of this particular controversy, the whole Federal Vision Auburn Avenue controversy, that we moved to adopt the Westminster Confession, and so I subscribed to the Westminster Confession within the last couple of years, and in the midst of this controversy, and so it's important to know what you're saying when you do that. What were we saying? And the fundamental thing that we were not saying is that the Westminster Confession is to be considered to be on a par with, either superior to or on a par with, Scripture. So if you make it over Scripture, then of course that's a violation of the confession itself and all Christian sensibility, because the confession says that the Scripture is the final arbiter of all matters of faith and practice. But we could also do what the Roman Catholics do. We could also fall into their error by saying, well, in effect, the Scriptures and the Westminster Confession are on a par, and of course they don't ever contradict. Well, once you say that, the Roman Catholics say the Bible and our tradition never contradict. Well, that means that when you have apparent contradictions, you've got to resolve them one way or the other. And if you've got an a priori conviction that your church's tradition, whether it's the confession or it's more nebulous as it is in the Roman Catholic setting, you're going to cause the Scripture to conform to the confession instead of the other way around. So the confession has to be subordinated to Scripture, and that means honest subscription as opposed to strict subscription. I do not know any way of engaging in strict subscription where I believe every jot and tittle of the confession without that subscription being tantamount to a statement that the confession is equal to or superior to Scripture. And I just can't do that. So what we do is we say, all right, this is a shorthand way of telling everybody where we are. This is what we believe the Bible to teach. It's not that we believe this is the only thing the Bible teaches, but on the subjects it addresses, we believe this is a faithful representation of the Bible's instruction and teaching. And if we differ at any point with the confession, when we adopted it, we had a list of exceptions, which is a standard practice in Presbyterian circles. So that's what we've done. But the Westminster Confession doesn't say anything about evolution, nothing about Darwin, nothing about egalitarianism, nothing about feminism, nothing about some of the broader biblical historical developments in theology, which are subsequent to the drafting of the confession. And yet we can all conceive of faithful Christians confronting the errors of their day 200 years after the confession, and what they're confronting is something that the Westminster divines would cheer on were they here watching us. They would say, well, it's your responsibility to do in your generation what we did in our generation. And that's how we understand the confession.
Yeah, and that's really in conformity to the Reformed tradition of confession making, and that the Reformed branch of the church has always been a church that's been willing to make confessions that are applied to present situation that they face and the problems they face.
Right.
And I think the confession was doing the same thing.
Right. The confession, at the time the Westminster Confession was confessed, it was not only a living act, it was a courageous act. There were people involved, there were livelihoods involved, there were political authorities persecuting. It was an act of courage, and what just wonderful godly men did what they did. Well, we can't honor their courage by being cowards now, right? And we're not going to acquit ourselves as heroes by standing against errors that have been dead for 300 years, 350 years. The thing that's going to get us in trouble are the enemies that are alive and well now, and it takes courage to stand against them. And they're employing new vocabulary and new heresies and twists and turns. The reformers didn't have to deal with things like open theism. They didn't have, that was not on, well, actually the Socinians were back there, so they had a variant of it, but in its peculiar form now, they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to deal with modernity. So the Westminster Confession is in the middle of the 17th century, right at the same time that Descartes is sort of birthing modernity. So the Westminster Confession really is, you can almost describe it as the tail end of the medieval era. It's certainly before the rise of modernity in its full-fledged force. And modernity presents a potent challenge to the historic Christian faith. And the Westminster Confession was settled before modernity took shape in all its different forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me ask you about something you said in one of your talks, which was you used the analogy of the Westminster Confession being like the Queen Mum.
Yes.
Tell us about what you meant by that.
In all political, that illustration I think I first picked up from Joe Sobran, who was talking about the U.S. Constitution, where the Constitution is a written document that says certain things, that requires certain things, but people want to use it for ceremonial occasions instead. So people, when people take the oath of office, they swear to uphold and to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's become part of our civic rituals, our civic liturgy. But if you gave the average congressman a copy of the Constitution, he'd be bewildered. What's this? What's this? and it'd be really interesting to how many of our judges and congressmen and representatives and bureaucrats and people running regulatory agencies, how many of them have actually read the Constitution? Well, not very few, and if they've read it, they're ignoring it. Well, but then at the same time, these same people, if some crisis hits or some disaster hits, they will invoke the Constitution. Right. They will appeal to the Constitution, whether the First Amendment or whatever. They appeal to the Constitution a lot. Well, the same thing happens in reform circles. People appeal to the Westminster Confession and our Reformed tradition all the time. But it's a document that you can actually read and study, and it says things, right? And so if the U.S. Constitution says certain things, and then you look at what's being done, and you read it again, you say, well, how can they do, the 9th and 10th Amendments, for example, of the Constitution prohibit the vast majority of what's going on under the heading of the federal government. The 9th and 10th Amendments absolutely just prohibit what's going on, and yet it's still going on. Well, the same sort of thing is true in the confession. In the shorter catechism and the larger catechism, it says, how are the two sacraments effectual means of salvation? It doesn't say, are they effectual means of salvation, with the expected answer being no, they are not. It assumes that they are effectual means of salvation and asks, in what manner are baptism and the Lord's Supper effectual means of salvation? Well, that's it. So if I were to walk into an average conservative Reformed group of people and say, I believe that the sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, are effectual means of salvation, people would go nuts. What are you talking about? Why are you using language like that? It's dangerous to talk like that. You can't say that because that's contrary. And then here they would invoke the confession that they haven't read, because the phrase is right out of the confession. It's as though I told some liberal from the ACLU that I have 3 guns at home, and because I have the right to keep and bear arms, and he looked at me like I was a nut and said, "Where did you get language like that? That's crazy talk." I said, "What do you mean crazy talk? It's right, it's right here in the, this is what the Second Amendment says." Well, it's the same with the confession. There are all sorts of in the controversy. I believe that we are being attacked in the name of the confession, where it's being appealed to, like the Queen Mum waving to the crowd on the balcony. How can you despise the Queen Mum like that? How can you be upset with her? How can you run her down that way? I wasn't running her down. I was quoting her, but they don't want her talking. They just want her on the balcony waving to the crowds for ceremonial reasons, and that's an abuse of what confessions are for.
Let me ask you about a specific thing that you've talked about before and that's still being discussed, and we've been accused of really trampling on something really vital to the faith if we deny it, which was the invisible church. And I know you don't deny it. I don't really. I don't deny it at all. But how helpful do you see this distinction, visible and invisible, that the confession does make? And I think, given the definition that the confession gives, I have no quarrel with it. But practically,
I think it's very helpful as far as it goes. So I have no problem saying the confession in chapter 25 says that defines the invisible church as the whole number of the elect, and I believe that there is a body of people known to God by name from before the foundation of the world, and this group of people, their number cannot be increased or diminished. So the whole number of the elect is present and real in the mind of God, and that's the invisible church. And that's how the Westminster Confession defines the invisible church. Then the visible church is the people gathered out of every tribe and nation together with their children, and they are set apart by the sacraments and the preaching of the word and discipline and so on. So those are the marks of the visible church. And I think that's very true. We've got the visible church, and God knows who will be there in the visible church at the end. And so that's why I've tried to make the same point. I'm not trying to replace the visible-invisible definition, but I'm trying to supplement the invisible-visible division by saying the same thing another way. So we have visible church and invisible church. Well, why not topple it on its side and say that we have historical church and eschatological church? In the eschaton, everyone will be, all the elect will be there. So the way the Westminster Confession defines the invisible church, the eschatological church is that body of people, the whole number of the elect. But at that day, it'll be visible, not invisible. So the eschatological church is the invisible church in its first visible manifestation. Visible to us. It's visible to God. The invisible church is visible to God, but only to God. At the eschaton, the invisible church will be made visible. And the historical church corresponds exactly to the visible church, as we go through history. And in the historical church or the visible church, you have wheat and tares together, you have sheep and goats together, you've got elect and reprobate together. And in history, it culminates in the manifestation of the elect. So I see the distinction I've made as simply saying the same thing that the visible-invisible distinction makes in another way that I think says a little bit more, but it says essentially the same thing.
Mm-hmm. What about one last thing? What I've contended, and I haven't asked you this. I don't think, at least I don't recall asking, but just to get your response, I've contended we're building on the confession rather than ditching it and trying to start something new.
Correct.
And is that pretty much the way you're seeing this?
That's my understanding as well. If you went through when I subscribed to the Westminster Confession, I took a small handful of exceptions to the confession, and they are pretty much the standard exceptions that good Presbyterians everywhere take, and so I took an exception on some of the definitions about the Sabbath, and I took exceptions there, but they're the standard sorts of exceptions. So I don't disagree with the confession. I want to subscribe honestly. So if there's any place in the confession where I know I differ, I would take an exception there. And I've taken the same sorts of exceptions that I think many of our adversaries within the Reform world have also themselves taken. I've taken those same exceptions, or the same kind of exceptions. And I don't have any problem saying, yeah, I believe all the rest of this stuff I believe. But I don't believe that this Westminster's summary of biblical doctrine is an exhaustive summary of biblical teaching. I believe it's an exhaustive summary of their position in their point in history at their time, and I think it's an accurate statement of all the things that they're addressing. Personal soteriology, individual justification. I agree with all those things. But I think there are other issues that they weren't confronting and that we are. And the Bible addresses the things that we're confronting, but they weren't confronting them at that time, and so they don't talk about it. So if I say that the Westminster Confession doesn't address these other things, I'm not critiquing the Westminster Confession. It's not their fault they lived in the 17th century instead of the 21st.
Well, do we need another confession? Last question.
Yes, I think we do. I think we need more than one new confession. I think it would be very helpful. I think I've been talking to some of the folks on the Auburn Avenue side of things. I think we need to draft a statement of. Here's the one problem. I think we need to put together a confession of what we mean by federal vision, what we mean by the Auburn Avenue stuff in a short, compact way. I think we need to do that. The problem with doing it and calling it a confession is everybody says, "Oh, now you think you're on the level of what you done." Look who thinks he's John Calvin.
Yeah.
Look who thinks he's a John Owen or some of the Westminster divines. And as you pointed out in your talk, Reformed pastors and ministers and sometimes individuals generated confessions, and up to the Westminster Confession, I think you said there was 50 different major confessions, and I think we need to start doing that again. And I'd like to see different groups do it so that if we did it, we wouldn't be seen as putting on airs or thinking we were something we weren't. But I do think we have a responsibility to say, okay, this is what we think we've learned, and let's condense it and put it out in a way that people can say, okay, this is what they're standing for. This is what they're saying.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.